Hi, my name is Dr. Constance West, and I'm a juvenile forensic psychologist working in the Atlanta, Georgia area. I am one of the co-founders of the CRESTS-Achieve program, and today I will be talking to you about Black children in the juvenile court system, what every educator should know. It is not intended that this video would be exhaustive, but instead it is intended to provide you with insights from my career as a forensic psychologist working in a juvenile court setting, along with presenting you with key information and supporting data that will hopefully inspire you to obtain additional training in this area and related topics. I am about to go ahead and share my screen so we can go ahead and get this presentation officially started. As a quick overview, I will be talking to you about some of the lessons learned from a juvenile forensic psychologist career. That's my career. I have worked in a number of different forensic settings, both inpatient and outpatient settings, and I will share many of the things that I've learned across my career. I'll present some data about juvenile courts, court involved Black youth, and juvenile court referrals from schools, so those that originate from school settings. I'll then discuss some of the various topics that are relevant for understanding Black children and their behaviors, everything from structural racism, educational hegemony, and traumatic stress. And then I will identify very briefly some evidence-based diversion programs designed for school settings, for delivery in school settings. Some of the key topics we'll cover will be structural racism, educational hegemony, traumatic stress, disproportionate minority contact, the school to prison pipeline, and diversion programs. So I'll begin by telling you a little bit about me and my experience. I worked as the coordinator of a mental health clinic that was um, located in a juvenile court building. So for 8.5 years, I worked at the Fulton County Juvenile Court coordinating the mental health team. And that team was anywhere from as big as 3 employees to 8 or 9 employees with a whole variety of master's level, undergraduate level, and doctoral level students, practicum students, and volunteers. I also worked for between 1 and 2 years as a forensic psychologist in an inpatient setting, working at the state hospital, Central State Hospital in Georgia. And I've worked for over 5 years as a clinical psychologist in private practice. To tell you a little bit more about the experience that I had for the longest amount of time, I worked at the Fulton County Juvenile Court in its Romaine T. Powell Juvenile Justice Center in the Atlanta, Georgia area. And that juvenile court is actually the largest in the Southeast US, handles over 9,000 cases annually, at least it did when I was working there. The overwhelming majority of the court involved youth were African American males from single parent households living below poverty level. That court has over 200 employees, including roughly 80 probation officers. So I spent quite a bit of time working very closely with probation officers, attorneys, judges, et cetera, educational advocates, of course, representatives from the school, et cetera. And of course, it had its own in-house mental health clinic, which was located on the second floor. And again, we had mental health providers, everyone from myself as a psychologist to licensed clinical social workers, licensed professional counselors, and marriage and family therapists, et cetera, working alongside a number of trainees, everyone from students from the undergraduate to the graduate level, um, working alongside volunteers. Here are some of the key lessons that I learned. And I could spend an entire day talking about all of this. The good and the bad, the good, the bad, and the ugly of the work. Overall, was extremely rewarding, very challenging. Definitely, requires a whole lot of energy, creativity, and innovation and resilience to work with this population. So one of the first things that I learned was that at every single level, at every single tier of the educational and juvenile justice systems, Black and Latinx youth, particularly boys, are more likely to receive harsher treatment for comparable behaviors compared to white youth, white males, and definitely white females with respect to suspensions in the school, so like being suspended or expelled from school, being referred from the school or the community to the juvenile court setting. Once involved with the juvenile court or having contact with the police, they're more likely to be arrested, to be detained, to be placed on supervision or probation, and or to be referred or bumped up to the superior court or the adult criminal justice system. Second lesson that I've learned is that court involved youth, particularly those who are Black or Latinx, often face formidable stressors and traumatic experiences due to a wide variety of factors, everything from social issues, economic, cultural, and political factors, and those include structural racism and oppression. Third lesson learned is that the system serving these youth, whether we're talking about the school system, the juvenile justice system, the mental health system, the um, just the community at large, often do not have the appropriate resources, emotional, financial, cultural competence, or other resources needed to adequately protect, support, and equip these youth for developmentally appropriate socio-emotional development and academic success. So what that means is that these systems are often overwhelmed with the number of youth coming before them, the needs of these youth and their parents and the community at large. And oftentimes they lack either the financial support to be able to offer the services that are needed by these children and families. Sometimes they don't have the skills that they need in terms of being aware of of the cultural factors and social factors that make working with these youth very unique in many ways. Um, and so what happens is there are a lot of unmet needs amongst these youth, and these systems become overwhelmed, and those people working in those systems oftentimes become burnout and or feel ill-equipped to handle their needs. Too often, these various systems, from the school to the mental health system to the family and broader community, fail to identify when these children are having issues, um, fail to accurately diagnose what those issues are, um, and fail to appropriately treat or address these conditions or issues. Everything from mental health issues, substance abuse issues, any developmental delays or learning disabilities that may be evident. There are issues in terms of how the educational system may support um, the status quo in terms of differential access to resources, and also in terms of traumatic stress. Okay, so there's a need for all of us who are working with Black youth and oftentimes other marginalized children, to acknowledge that we often play a role in often unintentionally traumatizing, oppressing, or otherwise hurting Black children, even when we have good intentions. So we need to be humble enough to recognize that maybe their behaviors are telling us that there's a problem in terms of how we're treating them. So what we see in the children often reflects something that's pathological in their environment. So it could be in their home environment, it could be in the school environment, it could be in the mental health treatment environment, or the community at large. And so we must be very humble to accept that maybe we're playing a role in hurting these children or traumatizing them, and also to be actively involved in correcting these problems. So we can't just take children out of these environments and so-called fix them and then send them back into environments that are very pathological and toxic. And there's a need for educators, ideally within the school system, to use evidence-based diversion programs that are culture-centered and trauma-informed and school-based, so that they can appropriately interpret and address the emotional and behavioral problems of Black children. Um, so not only will we be able to address the needs of children and Black children in particular within the school system, we can prevent these children from becoming involved with the juvenile justice system. Okay, so now I'll share with you a lot of the insights, a lot of lessons that I've learned over the course of my time working in the juvenile court system. And like I said, this is just the beginning. It's intended that this will just sort of wet your whistle to this topic, and hopefully you will seek additional training either from the CRESTS-Achieve program or do your own research and attend webinars and training programs and things of that nature in other areas in order to equip yourself to be able to address these issues. So, what does the data say about these issues? Well, the first study that I want to highlight for you is a study that was conducted through the National Center of Mental Health and Juvenile Justice, which is an actually great um, organization, and they have a lot of great resources on their website. This is from 2006, and one of the findings from this particular study was that about 70%, or a little over 70% of youth involved in the juvenile justice system, that's JJS, juvenile justice system, were found to have met criteria for at least one mental health disorder, with over 60% meeting criteria for three or more diagnoses. Okay. So, what that tells us right away is that when we talk about who's referred to the juvenile court system, what we find is that independent of race, what we find is that the overwhelming majority of these youth actually are youth with a mental health condition, right? And so, in some ways, what's happening is that the juvenile court system is being sent children who have mental health needs or issues that are often unaddressed and perhaps do not need to be referred to the court, but need to be referred to outpatient mental health treatment services. In addition, they found that over a quarter of these individuals, of these youth, had a mental health condition so severe that they required significant and immediate treatment. So it's not just they just meet criteria. They are a considerable number of them, about 27%, actually have a condition so severe that they require immediate or significant treatment or intervention. Some of the more common disorders included disruptive disorders and substance abuse disorders, which were a little under half of the study group, and then anxiety disorders, a little over a third of these youth, and then mood disorders. So almost one in five of them had a mood disorder. Um, okay, so now that we know that there's a large proportion of youth who are referred to the juvenile court system who have at least one, if not multiple, mental health diagnoses, and that many of them have significant mental health issues that warrant immediate attention. And we've gotten some idea about what those common conditions are. What do we know about suicide rates amongst youth involved in the justice system here in the US? So what we find is that there's an increased risk for suicide amongst these youth as well, with the suicide rate amongst youth in juvenile detention centers being about 4 times as high as those just in the general population. So it's really clear at this point that what we're talking about is that youth involved in the juvenile court system are in need of mental health intervention services, sometimes immediately, and yet oftentimes these issues are not addressed in the court system either. Um, and so one of the things that we saw was that about 50% of the youth have disruptive behaviors, so-called disruptive behaviors, okay? And what I want to challenge you to think about is that what is deemed to be disruptive in one situation and from one lens, through another lens, that same disruptive behavior or misbehavior can actually represent a very healthy or an attempt to be resistant or to resist something negative that's happening to them in the community, in the school system, in the mental health system, or in their own families. So, for example, what looks like misbehavior can often be resistance to structural racism or to educational hegemony. So, youth may be reacting to what they see as being systematic instances of racism, whether it be related to how teachers intentionally or unintentionally react to them different from their white peers. It may be based upon how the educational system maintains the status quo as it with respect to how um, the social stratification based upon race and ethnicity in America. Um, Oftentimes youth have experienced all sorts of stress, traumatic stress, and they're having symptoms of that. And it can also be having reactions to problems in their home or community setting. So, for example, in the juvenile court, I often saw that parents would bring children in, for example, to file an unruly petition against their youth, oftentimes saying that they wanted to have the child detained, not really realizing that they were in describing the issues and the circumstances in the home. They were actually describing problems in the home system or problems with parenting, maybe related to economic difficulties or a lack of consistent, you know, uh, parents in the household, or it could be that they did not have consistent access to electricity or water, or it may have been that someone in the household had a substance abuse issue or an untreated mental health issue, or that the community had a lot of violence, or there's a lot of racial oppression evident in that community, as it is in so many communities in America. And so, oftentimes, what children are presenting with are disruptive behaviors that are actually reactions to pathological circumstances in their environment, whether it be racism, educational hegemony, traumatic stress, and a wide variety of problems in the home. When we talk about structural racism, what are we talking about? We're not talking about individuals having biases or being discriminated against people necessarily. What we're talking about is a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work to and reinforce in ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. So the stratification within a society based upon race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, class, etc. And is a feature of the social, educational, economic, and political systems in which we live and work. Um, so it's not necessarily about a particular person, but it's about the way in which all of these things come together to perpetuate racial group inequity, in particular when we talk about racism. In terms of educational hegemony, what we find is that sometimes teachers can inadvertently discourage Black students from participating in class, for example, by turning away from them, by emphasizing their failures over their successes. It's not listed here, but having lower expectations of them or silencing their efforts to participate. There are issues with the structural and methods used. Sometimes they're very Eurocentric. Um, Sometimes the funds of information from Black students are not included in educational content, or what's actually included is pretty negative or includes stereotypical images. Um, it is also reflected in the way in which Black children are referred. So they're less likely to be referred, almost half as likely to be referred to gifted programs or to be considered for gifted programs, but twice as likely to be referred for behavioral problems, ADHD, low ability tracking, and corporal punishment. I've mentioned traumatic stress, so I want to talk to you a little bit about traumatic stress theory. It differs from what we think about typically in terms of trauma, in that it acknowledges that the environment itself is pathological, not necessarily the person who's reacting to that pathological environment. It focuses on the present and the future. So, in terms of ongoing traumatic events, as well as implications for future traumatic events. The fact that it is something that has occurred in the past, it is evident in the present, and that it is likely to occur in the future. It is observes that the trauma is unpredictable and sudden, and a key feature is also that the trauma occurs with impunity. So what happens is uh, it is understood that engaging in activities that traumatize individuals will not be punished. There will not be negative consequences for those who do that. And we see that with regard to things like police brutality, and that oftentimes these officers are not charged. If they're charged, they're not found guilty. If they're found guilty, they don't get any jail time, etc. And so what happens is people learn, people in the community understand, and that society understand that there are consequences for certain types of acts, but not those against those individuals who are considered to be um, unworthy of protection. So, what are some of the key behavioral symptoms of traumatic stress in Black children? Well, we may find them to be exhibiting verbal or physical aggression directed at authority figures, so perhaps teachers. It could be, the principals. It could be their parents. It could be police officers, judges, etc., and/or peers. So everything from yelling and cursing or threatening and teasing, insulting, defying authority, being disrespectful or dismissive, bullying, especially bullying the bullies. Sometimes what happens is um, children witness someone bullying someone and then they end up bullying that person as a way to retaliate or to protect people perceived as being weaker and engaging in physical altercations. There's disengagement, so they could either show very little attention in class, or in other settings, they may not be as cooperative. They may begin to perform at a level that is not consistent with their cognitive ability. So they're underperforming. Their grades are lower than they should be based upon their actual abilities. They may actually miss classes, miss school altogether. They may drop out or become very exhibit existence. I'm sorry, exhibit resistance. And lastly, they can engage in risky behaviors such as juvenile delinquency. So they may be doing things like stealing. Um, they may engage in substance use or abuse. They be engaging in early sexual behaviors, risky sexual behaviors, or both. And they may be more likely to become pregnant or to impregnate a young girl. So, what do we mean by disproportionate minority contact? Well, once these youth have been identified based upon their home environments, their own mental health issues, or the racism that they or oppression that they experience in the school, community, home, or mental health settings, um, they can become involved, be referred for one reason or another to the juvenile justice system. So, what do we know about disproportionate minority contacts? Usually, what that means is that at just about every level of contact with the juvenile justice system, African American youth, particularly boys, have more negative outcomes. So, even for the same sorts of behaviors, African American youth between the ages of 10 to 17, although they only represent 17% of adolescents in this country, they represent 52% of arrests for violent crime and 36% of arrests for property crime. Over recent decades, what we found is that Black children, and to a lesser extent Latinx and Native American children, are disproportionately given more severe consequences within the juvenile court system. So once they're actually arrested and they're involved in the juvenile court system, that's everything from formal court processing, whether they're transferred to the criminal court, whether they're actually detained or just arrested and released, and then whether they have out of home placements. So, um, so all of these things are much higher. The risk is much higher for African American or Black children, along with Latinx and Native American children, compared to their white counterparts. They are more likely within the school to receive office disciplinary referrals and suspensions. Um, so we look at the school suspension rate for Black boys is 3.6 times higher than those for white boys. And for school suspensions for girls, Black girls, it's 5 times higher. So it's even higher amongst African American adolescent girls. Within the court system, um, what we find is that Black children are more likely to be referred from the school system for truancy. So when we look at the referrals for truancy, we find that Black children are more likely to be referred from the school to the juvenile court for truancy related issues. Um, they're more likely to be referred to alternative schools, and thereby also more likely to increase their chance of having court involvement, everything from being arrested, um, especially since a lot of times alternative schools partner with juvenile courts to provide services. Once involved with the juvenile court, it becomes a whole issue of children being at increased risk for recidivism and for being referred to the superior court, so being bumped up to the superior court system. So really what happens is once children exhibit certain behaviors in the school setting, they're much more likely when they're Black or Latinx or Native American to be referred to the juvenile court. And once there, they're more likely to have more negative consequences. So within the school system, and within the court system, they're likely to have more negative consequences. Everything from being suspended or expelled to being arrested, detained, um, placed on probation or supervision, or bumped up to the superior court. I talked about that. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about some reasons for addressing behavioral problems within the school system or within the school setting, rather than referring those youth to the juvenile court. So what happens is, number one, so-called problematic behavior sometimes, as I've already indicated, have a lot to do with what's going on in the school system. Sometimes it's the school system itself, the way it's set up, the way the instructional methods, the teachers' reactions to them, oppression, culturally inappropriate comments, acts, or racism in general from maybe other peers within the school setting. If in that situation, it's important to look at those behaviors exhibited by the Black children and understand the um, the root of those behaviors, and recognize what they're letting you know. Their feedback is that there's something problematic in that setting and it needs to be addressed. So if you refer these kids out to the juvenile court system, even if you get a positive outcome, like they change their behaviors, they go back into the same system that was very pathological or problematic from the very beginning. And I've said in the past, and I'm saying now, that sometimes is like when the fire alarm goes off, you just turn it off rather than trying to figure out where what's the source, why did the alarm go off, and then putting out the fire. You just, you know, get rid of the fire alarm. So think of it that way, that the children are raising an alarm. Their behavior is the alarm for you, that there's something going wrong in that system. And in the juvenile court setting, we found that out by finding out, okay, we're getting a bunch of referrals from one particular school. Maybe one school is overrepresented in the number of referrals to the court. And then we go to that school and we look within that, maybe it's only one or two teachers really driving a lot of the referrals. And we find out that they're either new teachers or teachers that feel overwhelmed, that they feel sometimes uncomfortable or don't know how to appropriately deal with or manage the behavior of their children, particularly Black boys. And it's a matter of training, right? So we go back and say, okay, we're looking at all these referrals all of a sudden coming from this school, from these particular teachers. So then it becomes this whole issue of, what needs to be done. That could have been done without the court having to, review its referrals and figure out, oh, hey, there's a problem in this particular school with these particular teachers, right? That's something that can be done at the school level and can be addressed without getting the children involved in the court and have them stigmatized as being delinquents. The solution there, of course, is to excise structural racism and other issues that may be present in the educational system, whether it's a matter of training related to cultural competency or classroom management or um, instructional methods, etc. Another reason is that some of these behavior problems represent symptoms of mental health or substance abuse issues, developmental delays, neglect, abuse, community violence, and other issues that can be addressed outside of the juvenile court system. If there's a mental health or substance abuse issue, you can refer to a mental health or substance abuse treatment agency, right? You don't have to refer to the court and have us refer to the mental health or substance abuse treatment program. The schools can make those referrals themselves, and so that you can bypass it. If it's a child protective service kind of an issue, then that needs to be addressed. So you need to refer them to the court so that we refer to child protective services. You can make that referral on your own. And if there is an issue with community violence, it is important for schools and other important bodies to advocate for making changes in the community, because those are all issues that affect children and affect their behavior, right? And so it's not necessarily that the child is necessarily having a problem, although the child may be having a problem, but the root of that problem is something that the rest of us need to take ownership for and to do our part as well. Within school, diversion programs are often more effective than court involvement and prevent dual punishment. So, for example, sometimes children are, they exhibit certain types of behaviors and then they end up being suspended or expelled from school. Then they get referred to the court, they get detained, and they may be placed on probation. So, sometimes they receive punishment through both systems and it can be excessive, right? Referral to the juvenile court is very stigmatizing for some youth, and can lead to a whole host of negative outcomes. And sometimes, for example, in Fulton County at one point, children who missed 10 days of school were automatically referred to alternative schools, independent of what their in-school behavior was or how great their grades might have been. So I've had children who were AB honor roll students with no behavior problems in the school setting be referred to the court, even if that case ended up being, dropped. If they missed 10 days of school because they were detained for 10 days before the case was dropped, then, or, dismissed, then they were automatically sent to alternative school, which is additional punishment for something that they actually were not convicted of. So they end up getting punished through the court and through the school system. And oftentimes, when children go to an alternative school, they become demoralized and can end up either dropping out or starting to be exhibit, truancy related behaviors. And also, when you deal with it within the school, it's a lot more timely. There are times within the juvenile court setting that things move quickly, but oftentimes they don't. There are multiple continuances. The hearing is continued over and over again, and by the time we really hear the case, things have moved on. They've even either they've resolved and it's no longer an issue, or it's become so much worse when it could have been addressed had the school done something more immediate or referred to an agency that could do something that would be much more timely. Um, I talked to you already about harsh and delayed duplicate punishment, and that could be avoided when the school system addresses those issues that it can. In terms of evidence-based diversion programs, hopefully I've convinced you that the school is better suited. Not only that, the teachers in the school or people in the school setting know those children a whole lot better than outside agencies or definitely the juvenile court setting, right? Or juvenile court employees typically. And so, in many ways, staff at the school or the school setting is the ideal setting for programs to address the needs of children, and particularly Black children. So, what are some of these diversion programs? So, there is evidence for the following types of programs that have been identified through the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, or OJJDP. Great resource, great agency again. Some of those things include teen or youth courts, the provision of on-site mental health services, and I'll come back to that in a minute, restorative justice interventions, truancy prevention intervention programs, and mentoring programs. So all of these have shown some evidence of effectiveness when implemented in school settings. I want to go back to the provision of on-site mental health services. Oftentimes, schools have a considerable number of mental health professionals, whether they be school psychologists, school counselors, social workers, etc. And some of those social workers are, clinical social workers, so licensed clinical social workers. So these are all individuals who could provide clinical intervention services. However, it is often the case that these mental health professionals are charged with other activities. So psychologists do a lot of testing. The social workers oftentimes are doing addressing, other needs, right? For example, truancy prevention, that kind of thing. School counselors are addressing, vocational and guidance related issues. And so, although there are mental health staff, already employed by the school systems, they're often not assigned with providing clinical intervention services. So that's something to consider, whether schools can reallocate some of these individuals so that they actually provide and address the mental health issues that are identified. In addition, that they can look at that information and provide feedback to teachers and to other school staff about what needs to be changed in terms of the curriculum, in terms of policies and practices in the school, in terms of how they intervene with other agencies, etc. All right, here are some references that I am sharing with you. Um, I referenced a lot of the data from these articles. In terms of resources, SAMHSA is always great, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Um, OJJDP, I talked about, the National Center of Mental Health and Juvenile Justice, excellent resource as well. And then through our program, CRESTS-Achieve, we have a number of webinars. The overwhelming majority of them are free. Um, in particular, there are two that I want to bring your attention to. One was called Trauma Informed Care for Black Children. What's culture got to do with it? And that was a free webinar. And then Culture Centered Mondays was a webinar series we did back in November of 2020. It was a series, a four-part series that looked at a number of different topics, and that's something that is also available through Thinkific. And you can access all of this through our website, and that's www.crestsprogram.com. Here's my contact information. I appreciate your attention. I hope that this has gotten you motivated to learn more about how the education and juvenile justice system um, affects Black children and other minority children, and to become advocates for making changes within your organization so that you can better serve these youth and to promote academic excellence in them and social emotional well-being. Thank you. We look forward to having you to access our website, to look at some of the free resources. On our website, we have lots of different things. We have information about CRESTS-Achieve. We share lots of different resources, everything from concept papers to newsletters, and other, like I said, free webinars, other free resources, and access to our Culture Centered Mondays training program. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.